A few months ago, a woman I'll call Alice told me something that stayed with me. She said, "I feel like I'm doing everything right, but my mornings still don't make sense." She was 69, consistent, careful, the kind of person who pays attention. But every morning felt unpredictable. Some days she felt steady, other days, not so much. And what made it confusing was that her routine never really changed. Same breakfast, same timing, same habits. So we didn't start by changing anything. We started by looking closer. Because when something repeats every day, but gives you different results, there's usually a detail being missed. Now here's where it gets interesting. Her breakfast looked reasonable, nothing extreme, nothing obviously wrong. But when she began tracking how her body responded after eating, a pattern started to appear. Not immediately, but consistently. Her mornings weren't random. They were following a structure she hadn't noticed before. And this is something I see often. Not just with one person, but across many people over time. It's rarely about one bad food. It's about how certain combinations interact with your body, especially in the morning. Now, before we go deeper into that, there's something important you need to understand first, because this changes how everything else makes sense. Your body doesn't start the day from zero. In the early morning hours, before you even wake up, it's already active, preparing you to get up, to move, to function. As part of that process, your body may release stored glucose into your bloodstream. This is normal, but what happens next depends on what you do after waking. If the first thing your body receives is a fast-digesting meal, you're adding more on top of what's already there. But if your first meal is structured differently, the response changes. It becomes more gradual, more stable, and over time, that difference becomes noticeable. This is where something very simple comes into play: protein, not in a complicated way, just enough to shift how your body responds. And one of the easiest ways to do that is with eggs. Now here's the part most people miss. It's not about eating eggs, it's about how they're used. Because the same food can lead to completely different outcomes, depending on the context around it. Before we go further, think about this for a second. How long after waking do you usually eat? Because that timing alone can already influence how your morning unfolds. So let's go back to Alice. At first, nothing in her routine looked like a problem. She wasn't skipping meals. She wasn't overeating. She wasn't doing anything extreme. That's what made it confusing. Instead of changing her food right away, we focused on observation, just paying attention to patterns. When she ate, what she combined, how she felt afterward. And something interesting came up. It wasn't just what she ate, it was how everything was structured. Her meals were built mostly around foods that were easy to digest quickly, which meant her body had to process a lot, very fast, especially in the morning. Now here's where the shift happened. We didn't remove everything. We didn't give her a long list of rules. We simply changed the starting point of her day. Instead of building breakfast around quick energy, we built it around stability. Her new routine was simple: eggs, a small amount of healthy fat, and something with fiber. Nothing complicated. No strict measurements, just a different balance. And what happened wasn't dramatic overnight, but it was consistent. Her mornings stopped feeling unpredictable. Her energy didn't rise and fall the same way. And most importantly, she started to feel like she understood what was happening. Because that's the real shift, not just changing what you eat, but recognizing how your body responds. Now here's something worth noticing. We didn't fix breakfast. We changed how it was structured, and that's a very different thing. Because two people can eat similar foods, but get completely different results depending on how those foods are combined. And this is where eggs become useful, not as a special food, but as a tool, something simple that helps slow things down. Now before we go further, there's one more thing that often creates confusion, and it has to do with something many people were told years ago. Now before we go deeper into how to build your meals, there's something we need to clear up, because for many people, this one thought still creates hesitation: eggs and cholesterol. For years, people were told to limit eggs. Some avoided them completely. Others replaced them with foods that seemed like safer choices. And at the time, that advice felt logical. But over time, the way we understand this has become more refined. Not simplified, just more accurate. For most people, foods like eggs are not the main factor affecting overall balance. What tends to have a stronger influence are patterns that repeat every day, especially combinations of refined carbohydrates and added sugars. So what often happened was this. People removed eggs, but replaced them with foods that created faster and less stable responses, without realizing it. And that's why this conversation matters. Because it's not about labeling foods as good or bad. It's about understanding how they function together. Eggs, on their own, are very neutral in how they affect blood sugar. They don't push it upward. But they do something else. They help slow down the overall response of a meal. And when that effect is used correctly, it creates stability. But here's the key detail. That benefit only exists in the right context. If eggs are combined with foods that are quickly absorbed or prepared in a way that adds unnecessary load, the overall result changes. Not because eggs stopped being helpful, but because the structure of the meal changed. And this is the pattern we've been building toward. It's not about one ingredient, it's about how everything fits together. Now let's make this practical, because this is where small adjustments start to turn into real results. Now let's make this simple. Instead of memorizing rules, it's much more useful to understand a few basic principles. Because once you understand the principles, you can adjust your meals naturally, without overthinking. Let's start with the first principle. Keep the meal predictable for your body. That usually means avoiding unnecessary complexity. When too many elements are added, especially ones that are quickly absorbed, your body has to respond faster and less precisely. This is why simpler preparation often works better. Eggs don't need much. They already contain what they need. So when they are cooked gently, without adding extra layers, your body tends to respond more steadily. The second principle, slow things down, not physically, but metabolically. When a meal is absorbed too quickly, your system reacts quickly, and that often leads to a rise, followed by a drop. But when digestion is slower, the response becomes smoother. This is where combinations matter. When eggs are paired with foods that contain natural fats or fiber, the entire process becomes more gradual. Not because of one ingredient, but because of how they work together. The third principle, avoid canceling the benefit. This is where many people don't realize what's happening. They include something helpful, and then combine it with something that works in the opposite direction. So the final result feels confusing, because part of the meal supports stability, and another part pushes it away. That's why certain Pravichnaya combinations don't work as well as people expect, not because they're wrong, but because they change the overall balance. The fourth principle, build around structure, not restriction. Instead of thinking, what should I remove? It's more useful to think, what should I build around? When the base of the meal is stable, everything else becomes easier to adjust. And this is why eggs work well in this context. Not because they are special, but because they provide a stable starting point. Now here's something most people don't expect. Even if your breakfast is structured well, there's still another layer that can influence your results. And it doesn't happen in the morning. It happens the night before. Now let's look at the other side of the day, because sometimes, the reason mornings feel unstable has very little to do with breakfast itself. I want to tell you about someone I'll call John. He was in his 60s, very structured, very consistent, the kind of person who already had a routine that looked correct on paper. His mornings were frustrating, not because they were chaotic, but because they were inconsistent. Some days felt fine, other days felt off, and the pattern didn't make sense to him. At first, we looked at his breakfast, and it was already relatively balanced, nothing extreme, nothing obviously problematic. So instead of adjusting the morning, we shifted our attention. We looked at the evening. And here's what stood out, not the food itself, but the timing and the pattern. His evenings were built around comfort. He would eat a full meal, then later, something small again, not out of hunger, but out of habit. And this is where things become subtle. Because your body doesn't reset overnight the way many people assume. What happens in the evening carries into the night, and that carries into the morning. So instead of changing everything, we made one simple adjustment. Not every day, just a few times per week. We created a clearer stopping point in the evening, a lighter, more structured final meal, and then nothing after. No extra layer, no second signal. And what happened wasn't immediate, but it was consistent. His mornings became more predictable, not perfect, but easier to understand. And that's what matters, because once something becomes predictable, you can actually work with it. Now here's the key idea. It wasn't about removing food, it was about removing overlap. When signals overlap, your body has to manage too many inputs at once. But when those signals are clearer, the response becomes clearer. And that clarity shows up the next morning. So before you assume the issue is your breakfast, take a look at what happens before you go to sleep. Because sometimes, that's where the real adjustment begins. Now let's bring everything together in the simplest possible way. Because once you understand the pattern, you don't need complexity. Now let's bring everything together in a way that's simple and usable. Because once you understand the pattern, you don't need complexity. You just need clarity. Let's start with a few things that often get overlooked. Not big mistakes, small ones, but they add up. One of the most common is overcomplicating preparation. Adding extra steps, extra ingredients, extra layers, when in reality, your body often responds better to something simpler and more consistent. Another one is mixing signals, combining foods that work in different directions at the same time. Part of the meal supports stability, another part pushes things faster, and the result feels unpredictable. There's also timing, waiting too long to eat after waking, or adding extra eating late in the evening without realizing how it carries into the next day. And then there's this, trying to change everything at once, which usually doesn't last. So instead of doing that, let's simplify it into something you can actually follow. Here's a clear starting point. In the morning, give your body something steady early, within about an hour after waking. Build your first meal around a stable base, something simple, something repeatable. Add a small amount of fat, add something with fiber, keep the structure consistent. Eat in a calm way, not rushed, not distracted. Then observe, not for one day, but over a few days. Because patterns don't show up instantly, they show up with repetition. Now for the evening, you don't need to overhaul everything, just reduce overlap. Keep a clear end to eating. Avoid layering meals late without intention. Let your body have space to process what it's already received. That's it. No extremes, no complicated systems, just clearer signals. And over time, those signals shape your response. Now I want to leave you with one idea, because this is where everything connects. When people feel stuck, it's often not because they're doing nothing. It's because they're doing many small things without seeing how they connect. Once those connections become clear, everything becomes easier to adjust. You stop guessing, you start recognizing patterns. And that's where confidence comes from. Not from perfect routines, but from understanding. So start simple, try one adjustment, stay consistent for a few days, and pay attention to what changes. Because small, repeatable changes often create the biggest difference over time. If this gave you a new way to look at your routine, you can support more content like this by staying connected. And if someone comes to mind while you're listening to this, someone who feels stuck or unsure about their mornings, share this with them. Sometimes the right idea at the right time is all it takes to shift everything. This content is for general informational purposes and does not replace personalized guidance. If you're making changes to your routine, it's always a good idea to stay in communication with your healthcare provider. Take care of yourself.